This afternoon, I'd like for us to talk about the book of Ruth. It's one of the best known and probably most loved stories in the Bible. But brothers and sisters, I like to think of the book of Ruth as a sequel and not a standalone story. You see, the book of Ruth is a sequel to those terrible events that took place in the city of Sodom during the days of Abraham and Lot. The story begins when the wicked men of that city surrounded Lot's house and demanded that they send out the two visitors that were there. And we know, of course, that Lot's two visitors were known by us anyway, as angels of the Most High God. The crowd wanted Lot to send out his visitors so that they could abuse the men, that they might be abused by the mob. Genesis chapter 19 gives us the sordid details of that account. But as we look at the scriptures, brothers and sisters and friends, we find that the prophet Ezekiel provides and demonstrates to us the full depth of the sin that was taking place in the city of Sodom those days. It was not just the detestable behavior that they were going to perpetrate against these two men. It was a systematic problem that was permeating throughout that city. In Ezekiel chapter 16, the prophet gives us details about the sin of Sodom. He says in verses 49 and 50, she and her daughters were arrogant. They were overfed and unconcerned. They cared only about themselves and not about the visitors, not about those that were needing help. The prophet Ezekiel went on and said they did not help the poor and the needy, and they did other detestable things to the Lord. And therefore, according to the prophet, God said, I did away with them. In Genesis chapter 19, we read the details about the events that took place that day. The outcry of the city of Sodom, the outcry was so great that God chose to destroy the city with fire from heaven. In Genesis chapter 19, verses 24 to 26, we read, then Yahweh rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, including all those living in the cities, and also the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Now, we read these stories. We read this account. And if you're like me, you probably have a hard time sort of comprehending it all. You have a difficult time understanding, what must it really have been like? But as I was reviewing this talk in preparation for the gathering here, it was just a month ago that we came across the 20th anniversary of those horrible events that took place in New York City and in Washington, D.C. When planes went into buildings. We've all likely seen video and documentaries from those days back in September 11th. The faces of people looking on in horror. The devastation and destruction. The loss of thousands of lives. And when we think about what happened then, perhaps it makes it easier for us to comprehend what we are reading about in Genesis. And so after the firestorm came down from heaven and destroyed Sodom, two women huddled in a dark cave, traumatized. Everything they knew and almost everybody that they loved had been destroyed. They saw their mom perish before their very eyes. Their world literally came crashing down. And the next day, if they were to have stood up and looked out northward and southward and eastward and westward, as Lot did, everything these two girls would have seen would have been burned and would have been smoldering. People dead, livestock gone, trees and crops and vegetation destroyed, smoke just billowing up from the ruins. Society was so completely destroyed that these girls could see no way for life to return to normal. I mean, how could the human race even survive? Even though they were of child-rearing age, surely they must have reasoned. There's no one here alive that could continue our family line. And I think here's where they made their first mistake, their big mistake. Rather than trusting in God for a solution to their dilemma, they took matters into their own hands. Genesis chapter 19, we'll look at verses 31 and 32. One day, the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there's no man around here to lie with us, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father to drink wine and then lie with him in order to preserve our family line through our father." Verse 36, so both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites today. And brothers and sisters, in the intervening years, there grew an enmity. There became this hatred between the nation of Israel and the nation of Moab. The kings of Moab at one time conspired with one of Yahweh's prophets to encourage this man to curse the nation of Israel. That's how low it got. That's how much the enmity built up. And this hatred finally culminated with a provision in the law of Moses, which excluded Moabites from the assembly of Israel. We read about that in Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy 23, beginning at the 3rd verse. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, even down to the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way out when you came out of Egypt. And they hired Balaam to pronounce a curse on you. However, Yahweh your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because Yahweh your God loves you. And then it concludes with this statement: do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live. And so with that as background, we now come to the story of Ruth the Moabitess. She was a woman who was excluded from the citizenship in Israel. She was a foreigner to the covenants of promise, without hope and without God in the world. And the book of Ruth is a story of her redemption. It's actually a story of redemption altogether. Hers through Boaz, her redeemer. And it's a story of our redemption through the Lord Jesus Christ. And it's an amazing story that illustrates the hidden work of God, even in the very worst of times. So, brothers and sisters, friends, if you ever feel that God is far from you, if you ever feel that life's circumstances are too difficult, know that God is working in your life to bring you to his kingdom. His purpose in creating this earth was to fill it with a family of faithful believers who would bring him honor and glory. That all the earth would be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as we know. And the book of Ruth tells the story of one family that struggled mightily, but came out the other side because God was working silently in their lives. The book of Ruth begins by telling us that it took place during the time of the judges. We know the time of the judges was that time when every man did that which was right in his own eyes. As a result, God punished the Jews so that they would see the error of their ways. Before the Jews went into the promised land, Moses delivered to them these blessings and curses. Blessings if as a nation you obey me. As a nation, if you obey me, you will be blessed. Also, Deuteronomy tells us that if you as a nation disobey me, you will be cursed. Here's what it says. If you do not obey Yahweh your God and do not follow all his commands and decrees I'm giving you today, Moses wrote or said, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. People that you do not know will eat what your land and labor produce, and you will have nothing but cruel oppression all your days. You will sow much seed in the field, but you will harvest little because the locusts will devour it. So this was the promise that Moses had forewarned the people about, that if you disobey me as a nation, you will struggle, and you will struggle with your crops. And so at this particular point in time, when we come to the book of Ruth, we find that the land was experiencing a famine. Perhaps raiders came and destroyed the crops, or perhaps God stopped rain in Bethlehem, while Moab, which was only 30 miles away, received enough rain for their crops to survive. We don't know. But when we come to Ruth, we read this in verses 1 and 2. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. So it tells us that there was a man from Bethlehem. I'd like to make a few comments about Bethlehem. You know, at this point in history, the town was relatively unknown. You know, if we think of Bethlehem, you know, it just pops off our tongue. It's one of these most well-known towns in the land of Israel, because we know it as the place where our Lord was born. But in those days, it was very, very different. Bethlehem was hardly known at all. Consider the fact that it was not mentioned at all in Joshua 15, when the people went into the promised land and each tribe was allotted certain cities. When Judah received its 112 towns and villages mentioned by name, Bethlehem was not among them. That's how tiny it was. 112 towns and villages were named. Bethlehem wasn't even listed. The famous passage from Micah chapter 5, the prophet speaking about Bethlehem foretells this time about the birth of the Messiah. And he says in Micah 5, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come one who will be ruler over Israel. The point was just that. It was a tiny little unknown village. But what little we do know about Bethlehem at this point in history is not good at all. The book of the Judges ends with two stories that take place in the town of Bethlehem. The first is Judges chapter 17, and we read about this young Levite who is from Bethlehem. And he goes out looking for a place to live. And what happens is this Levite, who is supposed to be, he's from the tribe of Levi. He's supposed to be serving Yahweh, the God of Israel. He gets hired by this man, Micah, who has a collection of idolatrous gods. And he hires the Levite from Bethlehem to preside over his idols. And so the first thing we see in Judges about the town of Bethlehem is that it was this little town that seemed to have been leading the nation into spiritual apostasy. Judges chapter 17. And then we turn the page and we come to Judges 19. And it's there we read about the moral apostasy that was taking place. And it's that terrible story, of course, about a Levite and his concubine. Judges 19. Now a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim, this is Bethlehem, took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah, but she was unfaithful to him. And then the story goes on with shocking similarity to the events that took place in Sodom so many years before. Just as Lot had welcomed visitors in his home, here in Judges we see another man welcome an unknown visitor. And in Judges 19, verse 22, we read this. As they were making merry in their hearts, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came in your house, that we may know him. See, brothers and sisters, this is a mirror image. It's an echo that brings us right back to the same type of thing that took place during the life of Lot. And the account about the Levite and his concubine goes on to describe the terrible things that happened to that girl from Bethlehem. And I think the point is not to be missed. When the book of Ruth took place, there was hardly any difference between Bethlehem and Sodom. And so as the book of the Judges comes to an end, we see both spiritual and moral apostasy coming out of the little town of Bethlehem. We might conclude then that we can clearly see why there was a famine in the house of bread. But rather than enduring the discipline of God, Elimelech, the father in the story, he chose to take his family to Moab to escape the famine. As I mentioned earlier, as the crow flies, Moab is only about 30 miles away. But in order to travel from Bethlehem to Moab, it would have been necessary for the family to reverse the exact same route that the Israelites took when they came into the promised land originally. They would have had to reverse it. They would have left Bethlehem and not gone north to Jerusalem. And then once they were in Jerusalem, they had to descend this treacherous trail. This is the trail that we read about in the New Testament when we hear the story of the Good Samaritan. They descend this treacherous trail to Jericho, and it's there that they would have crossed the River Jordan. Now consider this. At the point of crossing Israel back into Moab, Elimelech and his family would have come across a cairn. I don't know if any of you are hikers, but if you're at least in the White Mountains in New Hampshire, for example, you get up above tree line, and in order to find your way along a trail, they will erect these piles of rocks. They're called cairns, and that's how, when the fog rolls in, that you can find yourself walking safely along the trail, a cairn. So when Elimelech and his family come down that steep, treacherous trail to Jericho, as they're about to cross over the Jordan River to go back to Moab, they would have come across a cairn. It was a pile of 12 stones, a memorial of 12 stones, piled on top of one another. And you would have thought that it would have caused this family, it would have caused Elimelech to pause and to say, maybe I should reconsider my actions. So turn with me to Joshua this time, not Judges, but Joshua. And we're going to look at Joshua chapter 4, and we'll start in the 4th verse. So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe. And he said to them, go over before the ark. So the context here is they are crossing over the Jordan to go into the promised land. And he takes an individual from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And he says to them, go over in verse 5, before the ark of Yahweh your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. Now, it's easy for us to look with a very critical eye backwards in time to Elimelech and say in our mind's eye, how could you be so stupid? How could you ignore such a beautiful memorial that was to warn you, that was to tell you about these beautiful things that took place, that was to remind you not to go back? How could you do such a thing? Moses said, you shall not now on return no more that way. And so, we can wonder how they could walk past that memorial. But we should remember too, brothers and sisters, that we have our very own memorial that we are to consider each week. It's not a memorial of 12 stones, but of one. We, of course, remember Jesus Christ, the chief cornerstone. And sometimes, maybe like Elimelech, we gaze out across the great gulf and we look at our own ecclesia and we see the world on the other side of this great gulf, and we see how green the pastures are, How green the pastures of Moab appear. And sometimes we look around us and we see what should be the house of bread, and we see little or no fruit. There are troubles in our ecclesias. There are troubles in our families. There are troubles in our lives. And in our moment of weakness, the temptation, brothers and sisters, may be very great to wander from the house of bread, to wander from the ecclesia. And I think the story of Ruth tells us that only death and ruin await us there. And before we delude ourselves into thinking that we're strong enough to go out on our own, before we make the mistake of thinking that our move will only be temporary, let's remember that Elimelech and his family intended only to sojourn for a while in Moab. But the record tells us they stayed there 10 years. And those 10 years were impressionable years in the lives of their two boys, their young sons. And so if not for ourselves, certainly we have an obligation to our children. Our children are a heritage to the Lord. We have a responsibility to God to raise them up in the way they should go, in the love and the admonition of the Lord. But as we know, Elimelech led his family across the Jordan River. But going to Moab was an unmitigated disaster. Elimelech died. The two boys died there. And after the death of her husband and two boys, the widow Naomi found herself alone in a foreign land without support. So she decided to return back to the land of Judah. Turn with me again to Ruth chapter 1. We'll look now at the 6th verse. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. Verse 7. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you. May Yahweh show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead and to me. May Yahweh grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." You know, I think there's an interesting point in these verses that I'd like to try and draw out. Verse 7 tells us that Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, the three of them, they actually did leave Moab. They left their home in Moab, and together they started their journey to Bethlehem. See it there, verse 7? She went forth out of the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But then in verse 8, something strange happens. Something happens that causes Naomi to stop. They had left together, they intended to go, but now Naomi stops. And she implores the girls to return, to head back, and to find new husbands and to find happy lives back in Moab. And I guess my question is, why? What happened? What's the change here that caused this pause? And I think there's a hint in the record that will draw this out for us. We find it in the last verse of chapter 1, and it says, "And they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest." I want you to think of that expression, the barley harvest. Because when we turn back to Joshua, let's look at Joshua chapter 3. In verse 15, it's here that we're going to read about the very first time the Jews crossed the Jordan into the promised land. Okay? Joshua 3, verse 15. Listen to how this verse begins. Now the Jordan is at flood stage, all during the harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the waters from upstream stopped flowing. And the priests who carried the ark of the covenant, verse 17, stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. But when they came to the Jordan and it was the barley harvest, the river was raging. When Naomi and the girls reached the Jordan, the river was raging. But this time there were no priests there. There was no ark to cross in front of them. This time there was no crossing on dry ground. Fording the river that day was going to be difficult and dangerous. It was life-threatening. That's why Naomi turns to these two girls and implores them to go back. You know, going back to the promised land can be a hard thing to do. Going back to the ecclesia can be a hard thing to do. Reminds me of an exhortation that I heard when I was a young teenager, and it's something that I still remember to this day. We had a brother in our ecclesia who had left the faith for many, many years. One day he returned, and I guess a long time after that, he gave an exhortation which he entitled, "The Most Difficult Step." Now, as I say, I still remember it. And he talked about how hard it was to sort of, as he said, swallow his pride or to overcome his embarrassment, to put his fears aside and cross back across the threshold back into Fellowship Hall at the Stoughton Meeting House. It was a hard thing. And sure, there was no raging river. There was no danger that he'd be swept away to drown. But in his mind, that small step across the threshold was just as difficult. I think there's a great exhortation to us, brothers and sisters, that we need to seek out the lost sheep. We need to greet the prodigal son. We need to find ways to allay their fears. So Naomi, standing at that river's edge, was afraid, and she urged her daughters-in-law 3 times to return. The first was probably, or likely in my mind, just a way that she could release them from any sense of obligation. And I think the next was to test their loyalty, sort of the same way Elijah tested Elisha those 3 times, or in the New Testament, the way Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Let's look at Ruth chapter 1, verse 12. "Return home, my daughters. I'm too old for you to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it's more bitter for me than for you, because Yahweh's hand has gone out against me." These 2 verses, Naomi is referring to something called the Levirate law. We read about it in Deuteronomy chapter 25. And it was a law that was designed to protect widows by obligating the dead man's brother to marry and support her. And it also ensured that the dead man's family line would continue on. And since Naomi had no living sons, there was no one available to fulfill that role as the kinsman redeemer. That's what they called it. There was no one available to marry Orpah or Ruth. And furthermore, even if there was, who would marry a Moabite like these two women? But I think there's another important point to bring out in verse 13. It ends with Naomi in verse 13 exclaiming, "The Lord's hand has gone out against me." And after she returns to Bethlehem in verse 20, she says she wants to change her name. She says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." And the point is this, brothers and sisters. God does not promise that our life will always be easy. There are times in our lives when it's very hard. There are times when the potholes in our life's journey might want us to sort of similarly exclaim, "The Lord's hand has gone out against me." People get sick. Loved ones die. We experience hardship. We experience disappointments. We experience things that we never envisioned in our younger years. Yes, there may be times in your life when God's hand is seemingly against you, against us. But usually, like Naomi, we exaggerate our hopelessness. And we can't see the rays of hope that are peeking out from behind those storm clouds. But God broke the famine, and God constrained Ruth to stay with Naomi. And God preserved a redeemer so that the royal line of Judah would continue. I think the point is that we should never become so embittered by what we might call God's hard providence that we don't see his mercy at work in our lives. Think about the exhortation that we read about in Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 12, we know it. Endure discipline. Endure hardship as discipline. God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So let's never forget that God is not necessarily concerned with our temporal lives, the lives that we live here and now. But instead, God is ultimately concerned with our spiritual lives so that we may participate, that we can become partakers in his holiness. So there they stood on the banks of the raging river Jordan. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, and she returned to her mother's house. Clearly, Orpah had affection for Ruth, for Naomi. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. She had affection. She desired to return to Bethlehem with her until she saw the danger of crossing the river. But she couldn't bring herself. Orpah couldn't bring herself to give up everything. And you see, there's a difference, brothers and sisters, between affection and allegiance. There's a difference between affection and devotion. And I think that's a great exhortation. We must not only love Jesus, we must completely devote ourselves to him. That means following him even when it's difficult to do so. Even when the waters of life seem to surge and to threaten to drown us with our concerns and our fears and our doubts. And then for the third time and last time, Naomi urged Ruth to return to Moab. But Ruth was devoted to her. The record tells us that she clung to Naomi. And then we read that remarkable confession of faith in verses 16 and 17. Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I'll stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I'll be buried. May Yahweh deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." We need to ponder these words. Sometimes we're so familiar with certain verses that we just gloss over them. We need to ponder what they're saying. They're simply astonishing. Ruth left her family and her friends. She went to Bethlehem knowing that a childless life of poverty and widowhood awaited her there. And not only that, Ruth promised that she would never return to Moab, even after Naomi died. And so with that confession hanging in the air, Ruth the Moabitess waded into what we might call the baptismal waters of Jordan. She didn't cross on dry ground like the Israelites who preceded her. Instead, she crossed while the river was at flood stage. And in so doing, Ruth was no longer a stranger and a foreigner, but she was a fellow citizen with the saints. She was a member of the household of God. She was a beneficiary of that great promise that was made to Abram, that all families of the earth will be blessed through you. So in chapter 2, we see the chapter beginning, and things are not as bleak as Naomi had originally feared. She told the women of Bethlehem that God had brought her back empty. But obviously, her perception was wrong. It wasn't true that she returned empty because Ruth was right there by her side. And additionally, Ruth was able to glean in the fields and gather food for herself and her mother-in-law, just as God directed under the law found in Leviticus chapter 19. And next, we find that God so happened to direct the steps of Ruth so that she so happened to find herself working in the field of one of Elimelech's relatives. Now, we know this is no mere coincidence, but the hand of God working silently and steadfastly to bring about his purpose. And that same hand of God works in our lives too, brothers and sisters. It's a truth that we should never forget. Back in verse 1 of chapter 2, Boaz is introduced in the King James Version as a man of wealth. This Hebrew phrase is translated elsewhere in the King James as a man of valor or as very able in another spot. The ESV translates the verse saying Boaz was a worthy man. The NIV says he was a man of standing. And I think when you bring all of these different translations together, you get the point. The point is that Boaz had a good reputation. But more important than his reputation is the fact that Boaz was a man of God. During this period, when the village of Bethlehem was falling away in both spiritual and moral apostasy, Boaz provided us with 3 good examples of what it means to live the truth, what it means to demonstrate your faith, what it means to be a proclaimer of the good news. First, we find in verse 4 that Boaz proclaims Yahweh to all. Remember Micah and all of his idols, and he hired the Levite to preside over his idols. This was a time of great idolatry in the land. And yet Boaz, we're told in verse 4, arrives from Bethlehem, greeted the harvesters, and said, Yahweh be with you. And they replied, Yahweh bless you. Second example is in verses 5 to 11, and they demonstrate how Boaz cared for the poor and the widows in their affliction. Remember in Ezekiel 16, we saw the sin of Sodom, that they were haughty, that they were overfed and unconcerned, that they did not care for the poor. Boaz was the exact opposite of that. Verse 8, Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I've told the men not to touch you. And whenever, and does that give us an idea as to the moral apostasy in the land? Then he says, go and drink from the water jars the men have filled. So then the third example that I bring out is what we see in verse 12. And here we see Boaz manifesting the character of God. God manifestation. He is demonstrating the characteristics of his God. We see him acting as an agent or as an instrument of God. Remember, Boaz was the one who provided refuge and protection to Ruth. Boaz allowed Ruth to glean in his fields. Boaz provided her with protection from the men. Boaz offered her kindness and generosity. And yet, as we'll see, Boaz attributed this kindness that he offered to Ruth, not to himself. He took no glory in what he did, but instead he attributed the kindness she received as a reward from God. He was quick to point out that Ruth did not take refuge under his wings, but under the wings of Yahweh. Verse 12, may Yahweh repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by Yahweh, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. And surely there's a lesson here for us in this day and age. Living a life in the truth is more than just trying to avoid evil. It's more than just trying to parse the exact doctrine. It's about doing. It's about living. It's about proclaiming the good news. It's about caring for the poor. It's about manifesting the glory of God in everything that we do. So when you leave this place today, when I leave this place this weekend, let's find ways to be a Boaz. Let's put our faith into action. Ruth was incredulous at the kindness that Boaz offered to her. In verse 10, we find her asking why. She exclaimed, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? And the answer, I believe, brothers and sisters, is Boaz had empathy. In Matthew's record of the genealogy of Jesus, we discover that Boaz was the son of Rahab, the former prostitute from Jericho. Boaz was the son of a former prostitute from a foreign country. If anybody knew the difficulties experienced by a foreigner entering the congregation of Israel, it would have been this unclean woman and her family. Joshua 6:23. So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her. They brought out the entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Yes, I imagine that Boaz knew firsthand how difficult it was, not only for himself, but for Ruth, the Moabitess, coming into the land. There are times in our lives, brothers and sisters, when we fall on hard times of one kind or another. And one of the benefits of the struggles that we endure, these hardships, endure hardship as discipline, we read in Hebrews. One of the benefits of these struggles is that we can develop an empathy for others who find themselves in similar circumstances. And so if you've lost a spouse, perhaps you can reach out to a recent widow or widower. Or if you've suffered from depression, perhaps you can provide support to one who is struggling with it now. Again, when we leave this place, let's find ways to be a Boaz, find ways to put our faith into action. So chapter 2 ends with a bit of a cliffhanger. Boaz has shown unmerited favor to Ruth the Moabitess. And Naomi, upon seeing the results of Ruth's gleanings, and upon discovering that her daughter-in-law has been gleaning in the fields of Boaz, she expresses this sort of unmitigated joy and gratitude. Verse 20, blessed be he of Yahweh, who's not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said to her, this man is of near kin, one of our next kinsmen. In other words, in Naomi's mind, she's convinced that Boaz is the one who could marry Ruth and fulfill the Levirate law by supporting Ruth and by providing a seed to carry on Elimelech's name. But the chapter ends sort of in a dud. It ends without Boaz claiming Ruth to be his wife. Perhaps she was too young, or he too old, or not worthy in his mind. We get a hint of that in verse 8 when Boaz referred to Ruth as his daughter. Perhaps Boaz didn't act, though, because he was deferring to another closer relative. In any event, the reader of Ruth is left wondering what will happen next. And so, God willing, tomorrow we'll pick up the story tomorrow morning. Thanks for your kind attention.